Hi, everyone. How are you? I'm Bhaskar Sakara, the editor and publisher of Jacobin magazine, and I'm often the host of these here Jacobin Talks on YouTube and on the Jacobin Facebook. Basically, every Monday, every Wednesday, and every Friday, I've been joined by a left-wing thinker to talk about an idea for around a half an hour. Then we've been doing a brief Q&A. We've been including your questions. So if you want to participate in that Q&A, just please leave your questions in the comments field, and me or another intrepid person will go through and grab these. And as always, this series is produced by Cale Brooks, and Cale is typing a reminder right now to tell you to hit like and subscribe and share the stream with your friends. That's how you get the stream to more people. And that's our only ask for now. It's a purely non-monetary ask at the moment. Obviously, Jacobin at this point is fairly established. We celebrate 10th year in publication. You know, we have tens of thousands of subscribers, and we have a lot of viewers online, but our YouTube channel is completely new. This is just something we started earlier this spring with the help of our late friend Michael Brooks, with the help of Anna Kasparin, with the help of Cale Brooks and others. So we're just getting started. We have 40-something thousand subscribers. We're trying to hit the mark at least 60,000 by the end of the year. So please do press like, press subscribe. That's how we get the feed to more people, and that's how we get out of our little bubble onto the left and begin competing, at least in the sphere of ideas, with the right and others who tend to monopolize a lot of attention on venues like YouTube and Facebook. So really briefly, our best site, to say that on Wednesday, we have Sam Gindin, the great Canadian Marxist, who's a frequent collaborator of Leo Panitch, writes a lot for Socialist Register and for Jacobin. He'll be talking about a vision of a feasible socialism, what it could look like. He'll be getting through some of the dilemmas he touched on in his long-form article in Catalyst Journal, and we'll be doing this more as a conversation, so it's not really a lecture, but it should be really good. Sam is incredibly smart, generous with his time. On Friday, we have Bashir Abumania, who will be talking about the dynamics of Israeli occupation. What's the latest, how we should look at the last 20, 30 years of Palestinian struggle, what the prospects for it are. And that's on Friday, also 6 p.m. Eastern. Another British guest, so he's the second one of the week that we'll have staying up late for us. And on Saturday, we have Big Waz joining Anna and Nando on weekends, which should be very, very excellent. That's at 1 p.m. on Saturday. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by my comrade, Owen Hatherley. Owen is the culture editor of Tribune. We collaborate on that often. I actually am up in Boston at the moment. I don't have a copy of Tribune handy, but I do have the latest issue of Jacobin, which Owen contributed to as well. And we'll be talking about a lot of different topics today. I think a lot of this talk will be guided around Owen's work. First book for Zero Books, Militant Modernism. And I think it's also worth plugging his latest book, Red Metropolis, which is just out now from Repeater Books. So you should definitely check out Owen's work. He'll be doing a little bit more work for Jacobin. So far he's been writing quarterly for us, but I think we're going to have him do some more commissioning, some more other work for the culture section of Jacobin in print by popular demand, actually. People have been emailing requesting that that Owen contribute more. I assume it's just Owen using multiple email addresses.
Absolutely.
If it's not, then there's real demand there's real demand out there. But really, you should check out his work in Tribune, in Jacobin, and elsewhere. And Owen today is going to be telling us about militant modernism. He's going to be telling us about why, in addition to Marxism, he's a defender of another lost cause, modernism. So, Owen, why don't you go ahead, and then when you're done, I'll give you some questions. We'll chat for about 10 minutes, and we'll take some from the chat.
Thank you very much. So this is a difficult one because it's about a book that I published, that I wrote when I was about 26, 27. And I am now pushing inexorably to 40. And that has that kind of awful thing that you kind of look at things that you thought when you were a bit younger. But I'm going to pretend that I still think everything that I argued in the book, and approach it with total lack of ambiguity, which I think is the correct line for Jacobin. This book was published by what we thought would be a completely kind of fly-by-night Mickey Mouse publisher, and turned out to be in the end, which was Zero Books, which was founded by a group of bloggers and a novelist with some money from a weird kind of mind, body, spirit publisher operating out a barn in the countryside in the south of England. And to our enormous surprise, these books, which these sort of group of bloggers had written, turned out to be mildly successful. The most famous of these, by far correctly, is Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. But somewhere kind of like in the second or third or fourth division is my book, Militant Modernism, which was the first Zero book to come out. Zero Books ended up, after an acrimonious battle, which I won't tell you about, becoming repeater books, and there is a sort of non-canon Zero Books that still exists, but that has absolutely nothing to do with anyone that had anything to do with Zero Books, apart from the guy that ran the barn. So, can I have the first image, please? So, the cover of this book was by the Scottish architect and critic Douglas Murphy, who wasn't an architect or critic at that point. And is an image of a kind of building or a sculpture that kind of encapsulated this idea that we'd made up, called militant modernism. And that idea was sort of aimed at something quite specific, which was both sort of a particular attack on the idea of modern architecture and modern planning, based on it being, an alienating failure and miserable and wet and horrible and et cetera, and if you're on the other side of the Atlantic, un-American. So it was kind of aimed at that, but it was also aimed at a particular attempt to kind of defend it by kind of sort of acknowledging that critique. So people like, who now are quite forgotten, but were quite important to the book at the time, such as the Swiss-English philosopher Alain de Botton, who kind of argued that all of the kind of political aspect of modernism was kind of bad and kind of to be moved on from, and that said we could just see it as a kind of form of design and a form of architecture, which you could or couldn't involve yourself on if you wanted to. Kind of, like reading complicated books, you could like complicated architecture if you were really, really cool. So I thought both of these were rubbish. And this image, which, can I have it back so I can explain it? This image was kind of part of an anecdote which appears at one point in the book that kind of sums up the connections that I wanted to make in it. So this is a sort of sculpture and building in the middle of a public housing estate in a town in County Durham in the northeast of England, a mining area at the time, called the Apollo Pavilion. And it was built in 1969 to the designs of the artist and sculptor and constructivist, sort of neo-constructivist, inspired by the work of the Russian avant-garde Victor Pasmore, who taught in the big city up the road, Newcastle. And it was This new town, Peterlee, had been founded. It was the only kind of new town of the several that were built in Britain after the war that were commissioned by its inhabitants. So there was a group of miners in the northeast who wanted a new town, and they wanted to kind of move out of their kind of Victorian, kind of drafty, damp, kind of slum housing and have themselves their own new town, which they named after Peter Lee, a miners' leader, hence Peterlee. And they commissioned as its original architect and planner a man called Bertold Lubetkin. And Lubetkin was a communist, was a citizen of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, who had sort of traveled around Europe as a sort of roving attaché for the USSR, which had eventually wound him up in London. And Lubetkin was kind of best known at the time for a building called the Finsbury Health Centre, which was one of the first kind of buildings of the, or one of the first buildings, one of the buildings that helped create the National Health Service, the socialised healthcare system that helps us not be quite as screwed up as you are. At the time of the building of this health centre, it was heavily criticised in the press for being this kind of avant-garde Russian constructivist building. There was this kind of question of like, can the people in this slum area of London understand this kind of complex, strange avant-garde building? And Lubetkin's response to this was, nothing is too good for the working class. So I thought, what a wonderful phrase, what a fantastic, resonant idea. But of course, these things never run smoothly. So Lubetkin's proposals for Peterlee were rejected by the Coal Board, the nationalised coal industry, which were obviously planning to exploit much of the site for the purposes of coal mining. They reckoned that these buildings were too large, were too heavy, and would cause subsidence, and therefore would be unsafe. So Lubetkin was sacked, and he went off to live as a pig farmer for the rest of his life. About a decade or so after this great failure, there was another attempt by the people of Peterlee, who had been very disappointed by this, to kind of have another kind of heroic futurist moment at the centre of their town. So in a new housing estate not far from the centre, which was being built, they commissioned Victor Passmore to design this kind of constructivist sculpture at the heart of the area. And by the time this book was written, these ideas, of course, had fallen enormously out of fashion. They had a rather more fashionable since, which is correct and good. But at the time I was writing this, the building was rotting to pieces, which, as you can see, Douglas has kind of tried to represent in the image of the kind of dampness of the concrete and so on. In recent years, it has been restored and is now very popular, and people come from far and away to visit. But it sort of summed up to me this entire kind of story of there being actually a link between the working class, the labour movement, and modern architecture. That it wasn't something that came purely from the top down of kind of like, we are going to make you live in concrete tower blocks that are terrible, as opposed to your slums, which are wonderful. Instead, this was a response in many cases to a demand. And that there was, in many ways, a kind of alliance between modernist architects and the labour movement. That was my idea in it, anyway. And I think I was sometimes right. Can I have the next image, please? So the book is an odd one insofar as it doesn't really make a kind of polemical A to B argument. I don't kind of like try to prove a point. It's more kind of, it proceeds via kind of anecdotes and tales and stories, and some of them are quite personal. So this is one of the personal ones, and this is about the reconstruction of Southampton, where the boats used to go to Manhattan until Heathrow Airport took that over. And Southampton is where I grew up. It's where I was born in 1981. It's where I, was born in its public hospital, educated in its state schools. We don't say public school to mean state school because we're weird. Lived in its public housing, played in its public parks. And in this particular case, went to its strange modernist beach. So on the kind of estuary that the ships kind of, as they still do, kind of come in to Southampton. There is on one side a very large power station, an oil refinery. On the other side, there is this. You have these kind of high-rise blocks of flats that were supposed to kind of announce two things to the person arriving by ship. One of which was, hello and welcome to the city of Southampton. You know, we build these grand futuristic buildings. And the other was a statement of what was regarded as most important and most monumental. It's a kind of always a good rule of thumb that whatever the kind of tallest buildings are in a given city is what is considered most important. So obviously in when people were more sincerely religious than they are now, it was church spires. In the case of the present day, it's real estate. In this particular case, it was public housing. And it is the building that tells you are here. So there's this statement of like, the most important thing we do is provision of housing for the working class in these very dramatic buildings, which we're going to make sure you can see from miles and miles and miles around. People in the surrounding countryside, which is heavily conservative, were not quite so pleased about this. So as a place which I played in hundreds of times as I grew up, this beach is a thing that always kind of stuck in my mind. And as I kind of moved to the capital, was very much a thing that kind of, to use a word that we were using a lot at the time in 2008, haunted by. There was this kind of like ghostly modernism that sort of lingered around, of a kind of unfulfilled promise, which had kind of gone halfway, as it were, to kind of creating or helping create an egalitarian society, and then stopped. So the story then kind of goes from there and goes to London, and the next image, which is another kind of tale, another anecdote, and this one to do with the effects of the Cold War. And this is another Lubetkin building in quite close to the centre of London, another public housing block, and this is its main staircase. And this is one of the tall tales, which is apparently completely true, that feature in the book. Round the corner from this block of flats, which was again in an area that was very heavily bombed, as was Southampton in World War II, just around the corner was the house where Lenin had lived when he lived in London. Lenin was, of course, a big fan of London bus network and of sitting on the top deck of the London bus network discussing its architecture and planning. As you'll know if you've read Memoirs of Lenin by Nadezhda Krupskaya. So, needless to say, Lubetkin was commissioned to construct a block of public housing that would be called Lenin Court, after the great leader of the world's proletariat. That building was substantially constructed by 1948, when the Cold War really began in earnest, with the coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia, the foundation of NATO, the Berlin blockade, and it became clear that the world was forming into two blocks, and that the wartime alliance, which would produce such a thing as this, was no longer viable. Outside the building was a monument to Lenin, also designed by Lubetkin, which had a mass-produced Lenin bust at the center of it, so that every time it was sort of defaced or broken by fascists, Lubetkin could just put another one in there, which apparently happened several times. In 1948, the monument was dismantled, and the building was renamed after the foreign secretary who had just passed away, Ernest Bevin, a former trade union leader, and of course one of the principal founders of NATO. Lubetkin's partner Francis Skinner later said we only had to change 2 letters. So it went Bevin Court out of Lenin Court. Lubetkin then, under the staircase, buried the Lenin monument, which apparently is still somewhere at the bottom of this. And here at this staircase, all of the kind of ideas of this sort of militant modernism are sort of poured in. You have this kind of transformation of this very, very mundane thing, a simple staircase that gets you from A to B. There's actually a lift. You don't even have to take the staircase in this 10-story block. Is transformed into this gigantic kind of constructivist sculpture that sort of sweeps you up layer by layer. in a similar way to the Guggenheim Museum in New York a couple of years later, but obviously vastly better. Can I have the next one? So the book really takes place in two places, one of which is an actual Britain and the other of which is an imaginary Soviet Union. I later spent a lot of time in that part of the world and had cause to revise many of my judgments, but we'll come to that another day. I will pretend I've never been there now. I still can't speak Russian. So this is a still from the 1924 film Aelita, Queen of Mars by the director Yakov Protozanov. And it's very much a kind of an artifact of another kind of alliance which is happening in this period, which is between modern architecture, socialism, and space, something which obviously has a major role later after the death of Stalin, when the Soviet Union won the space race, which it did. And this kind of marks this kind of the sort of intensity of cosmic dreaming that was happening at the time. Not just was it kind of possible, considered possible to kind of reform society on this planet, it was also considered possible and desirable to do it on other ones as well. So I ended up kind of making this arguably fanciful argument about the Soviet Union and about the importance both of space travel and the importance of the then total destruction of the society after 1991. So really this kind of idea that you could sort of define this thing both by the sheer intensity of its ambitions and by the totality of its failure. Again, this is me at the age of 26. Can I have the next image, please? So as a kind of way of describing this failure and the scale of its failure, I relied a great deal on a book by the photographer Richard Pear called The Lost Vanguard, which attempted to document the very, very wide range of avant-garde constructivist, militant modernist, so to speak, buildings that had been built in the first decade or so of the USSR before Stalin came to power in around 1929. There's a little overlap. They still get built for another couple of years, but Stalin's own tastes were a little more blinging. So what fascinated me about this book is that he'd tracked down all of these buildings that had all actually happened and was kind of documenting their current state. So this is a factory kitchen, so to speak, an example of a type of building which the early Soviets called the social condenser, which very, very, very roughly speaking was a kind of building that was intended to sort of inculcate socialist values by kind of planning buildings where people would be encouraged to meet, where different functions would overlap, different parts of society would kind of encounter each other. So you would kind of like layer onto each other, say like a gymnasium, a library, a canteen, a school, a cinema, a chess club, a planetarium. This is a specific building I'm thinking of in Moscow here. And you would kind of layer all of these things via these kind of like grand public spaces that would then connect them. Anyway, here is what one of those grand public spaces ended up looking like. So this is a picture from around 2005 or 6 by Richard Pear of this factory kitchen in St. Petersburg, this kind of, the kind of awful failure of this building and of this kind of project as part of it. The kind of text accompanying this, Pear talks about finding several homeless people living in the shell of this building. There's a whole load of other stuff in there about cinema and Tarkovsky and ruins and so on, which it was a bit over the top even at the time. So can I have the next image? So there were kind of 4 parts to this kind of idea. There was kind of first part, sort of the ruins of social democracy in Britain and my own memories of them. the second part was this kind of idea of this incredible, overambitious failure in the USSR. And the third part sort of continues that, talking about, I guess, the kind of emotional life of these social condensers, the kind of somewhat imaginary kind of emotional and sexual life that took place in them. So this is a poster from, if I remember rightly, about 1926, which demands, give us the, free us from kitchen slavery, give us the new bit, which roughly speaking is everyday life, the kind of life seen as most mundane. So the kind of, both kind of Russian socialists and Russian kind of artists in the early 20th century were obsessed with this question of bit, of this kind of everyday life, seen in this kind of like miserable, kind of like grey, kind of crap everyday life. You know, that bit kind of meant, you know, people beating their wives. It meant sort of shit food and shit work. It kind of meant kind of superstition, conservatism, boredom. This is kind of was also encapsulated in this kind of monosyllabic word. And they would sort of transform this by creating this sort of novi bit, this kind of new everyday life, which would be based on kind of comradeship and modernity and education and light and air and so forth. And at the center of this was this idea that the crucial thing that had to be done in order to create the new everyday life was the liberation of women. That was of absolutely crucial importance. So here you see, you know, the kind of liberation of a woman from the kitchen into behind her some sort of social condenser type buildings, kind of heralding this new life, which of course are incredibly kind of modernist and glass and concrete in their form. So obviously in the kind of USSR, this didn't entirely work out. There's a kind of winding path to it not working out, but you know, there it is. The next image, I think, comes, so this comes from, I think, the attempt to sort of reconstruct this idea after 1968. So I have very, very complicated feelings about that kind of, the kind of new left in 1968, of kind of, on the one hand, being kind of irritated by their kind of critique of the welfare state and of planning and of kind of engineering and modernity in general. I think there was a sort of hippie aspect to it, which I find feeds very obviously into the all-pervasive conservatism of that generation today. But there's another aspect of it which I find very attractive, which was based on trying to kind of fulfill these ideas of the 20s and 30s and 40s that had failed, and trying to take them seriously and kind of go, no, this was not about, you know, everyone having like a good single family house, or everyone having like a good kind of like enclosed flat for them and their family. This was not about kind of like, you know, doing the nuclear family, but better. This was about completely revolutionizing everyday life and eliminating the traditional family. Next picture. So both of these, oh no, hang on, one back. I think there's one missing. There should be one between, oh no, sorry, my notes are wrong. So can we go back to that one just before? Thank you. So this is from a film called W.R. The Mysteries of the Organism by the Yugoslav director Dusan Makavejev, which is basically about the kind of the 1960s rediscovering these ideas and kind of experimenting with them and kind of taking them to places that they wouldn't have beforehand, such as experiments with gender, such as much more sort of radical experiments of communal living. And in the film, to cut a very, very long story short, this all comes to grief when the main character, our kind of heroine, who's inspired by these kind of ideas of communal living, and particularly inspired by the formerly Marxist psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich, who ends up meeting a bad end in the USA. Inspired by these ideas, she kind of meets a Soviet figure skater and then it all goes terribly downhill. So again, I kind of wanted to take these ideas very seriously, even though they're quite silly. I wanted to kind of take, rather than kind of going, well, we all know it went too far. We all know, that it kind of got to this sort of extreme level. And instead to kind of go, well, this deals with problems that still haven't been solved. The kind of male violence hasn't been solved. The question of the nuclear family hasn't been solved. The question of, and even more mundane, and you can link these to mundane questions of public space, of kind of who gets to live where, of kind of who gets to kind of design spaces and why, and so forth. You can kind of link these kind of seemingly quite rarefied and quite kind of out there ideas with much more kind of ordinary ones about public space. So that's what's going on in there. And the last chapter, which I will talk about only very briefly, was about the great German Marxist playwright Bertolt Brecht. And really the point of that chapter was to argue with people that thought he was boring, because they'd seen lots of very boring productions of the Caucasian chalk circle. And I wanted to kind of make this argument that actually his work was very, very exciting and was based on action and jokes and fun and was very, very fast-paced and very, very funny. The kind of humor of them is really, really missed. That there's elements of Brecht which are much closer to Mel Brooks than they are to Derek Jarman. And I wanted to kind of celebrate those aspects, those kind of, which Brecht himself kind of talked about as being, in the phrase, plumpes denken, which he meant as kind of crude thinking, thinking about food and sex and so forth as being very important things rather than kind of, base ones. So this is from his film, which he collaborated on with the Bulgarian director Zlatan Dudov, Kula Vampa, made in 1932, one of the last films of the Weimar Republic, before it was crushed and before its very, very creative and elaborate socialist culture and socialist media culture was also crushed. And the last scene has this kind of group of enthusiastic young socialists kind of marching into the distance through an underpass. And it's this very, very poignant scene because you know very much what's going to happen to these people. Many of them would die in Nazi concentration camps. Some of them would die in Soviet concentration camps. So this kind of, they were all kind of marching in reality to this awful fate. And so I sort of wanted to kind of end with, why does this thing end? Well, partly because it's brutally, brutally suppressed. But also they're singing a song at the time. They're singing a song which composed by Brecht and the composer Hans Eisler, in which the refrain is "forwards, not forgetting," and that was the kind of watchword of the book. Really, it was a kind of call for kind of going forwards beyond capitalism, beyond even the nuclear family, beyond the kind of the capitalist city, but in so doing so kind of by remembering the kind of the failures, the attempts, the experiments, and kind of taking them rather than as kind of jokes, taking them more as kind of bricks that we could kind of help use to construct a better society in the future. So that's what that was 12 years ago, and I'd be interested to know what people think of it now. Thank you.
Well, that's great, Owen. You make yourself seem much older than you actually are. I like the retro. Actually, it fits with a lot of your work. The fact that we have that, the look back. So when we talk about the ruins of social democracy, and we talk about let's say the nostalgia that, and obviously you get at this in your Ministry of Nostalgia work as well, but the nostalgia that fills in particular UK politics. I guess there's that tension between, like you're saying, taking inspiration, taking and understanding this history without completely valorizing it. So to bring this to, let's say, the contemporary UK, do you think there was something about the Corbyn project becoming a prisoner of the old achievements of laborism and the old achievements of the UK welfare state, as opposed to presenting itself as fresh and modern and the wave of the future. And obviously, this is somewhat ironic coming from me, given what most of my criticisms are. But let's say Blair, right? And again, like, this is the closest I'll ever come to apologetics for Blair, but it's not apologetics for Blair. But his aesthetics, right? The things are only going to get better kind of emphasis, versus, I guess, the fact that we're pushed into rearguard defenses of the existing welfare state, and we're trying to maintain a very rapidly disintegrating coalition. Like, we're trying to maintain traditional labor heartlands. We're trying to maintain lots of things before it's completely washed away. And it seems like in that effort to kind of have a rearguard defense, it seems like a lot of the emphasis was in this from a very different spirit than, let's say, the modernist project. So there's a lot there.
I figured I would get your I think where to start. I think the weirdest thing about this is that of the two manifestos, it's the one in 2019 that was the most futuristic. And that was very, very deliberate. That was, it was supposed to kind of go beyond 2017 and its quite ordinary social democratic demands for nationalization and council housing and higher taxes on the rich. Instead, it was, it obviously borrowed from the kind of left futurism of the last kind of few years in the UK, like Alex Williams and Nick Cernicek, of Aaron Bastani and so on. It kind of tried to put parts of that in the program. The free broadband, the 4-day week, the proposed universal basic income. That all of these came from this kind of like futurist fringe. Not necessarily because I think they're bad ideas, but it was kind of curious that this kind of like moment from Blair, almost, as you say, of like, we are going to create something new and fantastic, was actually the moment of greatest failure. And I think actually that's because a combination of the Brexit kind of conundrum and the press hate campaign meant that it was a totally unwinnable election, and they could have promised, infinite gold for every household, and John McDonnell could have personally shown them his bag of infinite gold.
Well, I should say
it was unlosable. But I think going back to that point about nostalgia, the weirdest thing is that the kind of beneficiaries of that post-war welfare state are those that seem to have the least interest in it. They seem to have least interest in preserving it or expanding it. I think in many cases people seem to think it still existed. I've had some of my own kind of interactions with people of that generation where they've kind of, I remember once being threatened of eviction and being told, why don't you go to a rent tribunal? It's just like, this is a whole other world. Whereas, when you talk to a lot of people in kind of things like Young Labour, they were often much more attached to the idea of like, let's just get the state to build stuff. That this is a thing that needs kind of like large scale utopian solutions that will probably come from the top down. And you can see that one of the kind of like ways that Corbynism has fractured after the election, as it kind of, goes into kind of tiny little fragments, that a lot of them have been about this question of, were we too interested in nationalizing things? Were we too close to 1945? Should we be exciting and futuristic? And, I always think of that line from Sebastiano Timpaniero where he says that, so many attempts of like going beyond and creating a new socialism actually end up creating something very old, which is capitalism. And I think there's quite a lot of the people that are most opposed to going back to the past are going back to another past altogether, which is just the system we've lived under for the last 300, 400 years.
Well, I guess Corbyn's program itself was a very revolutionary program. It wasn't maybe per se in part because of media hostility, right? They wanted to portray Corbyn of the past. They wanted to portray people in his inner circle as Marxist, not even Benites, but an old kind of 1960s, 70s, or even in some cases 30s style, communism, and I think that prevented some of the message from getting across. So it might be, in other words, that the Blair PR program was just slicker, and with the help of the media and a young leader, they were able to put themselves a little bit differently than we were, despite our more modern program.
But of course, it was led by people who were formed most of all by '68. The Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and Diane Abbott, people that came into Labour in the '70s, kind of almost as a result of like, where do you put all of those energies? Well, let's try and put them through the Labour Party and see what happens. And they had a kind of first attempt, which led to the Greater London Council in the 1980s, and they had a second attempt, which was the last 5 years. So neither was entirely successful. But they were. But the interesting thing is there was such an incoherence. Like, I kind of get irritated by a lot of kind of analysis of the election, because you would knock on someone's door and they would tell you that one person would tell you that they're not voting Labour because of the Iraq War. The next one would tell you that they wanted the railways nationalised and they also wanted all the immigrants to be sent back. And then you'd go onto the next door and you'd find like a 25-year-old who believes in full communism. And like that's what it was like. Like, there was a cluster of things that made very little sense collectively together.
But I think what was behind this moment was just also just material prosperity, which was at the root of the optimism, right? That social surplus was growing, and it's not just a matter of, can we preserve our welfare state with our social surplus today? It's, what are we going to do with all this leisure time and all this wealth that we see in 20, 30 years from now? Whereas I think when our generation thinks about the wealth of the planet 20, 30 years from now, we're thinking about how will we survive and ration and still maintain some form of dignity and respect for each other amid climate-induced austerity, right? So even in the Soviet Union, it seems to me that the failure of the Soviet experiment's failure, let's say, of its social housing or any of these other big, ambitious projects, was the fact that the ambitions of its planners never caught up to the lack of wealth. Whereas in today's capitalism, it seems like, at least if we forget about the long-term horizon of climate crisis, there's no social vision.
Yeah, I think that's I have little to add to that in a way. I think that's very much one of the neuralgic points. There was also, I guess, a kind of feeling of, the language to interpret this disaster that we know is on the way, we know has started, is being taken from the ways that previous disasters were dealt with by social democratic movements. So obviously over here, there's the kind of endless obsession with the NHS, but we have borrowed your phrase of the Green New Deal, which again is this kind of, I don't know why we use the phrase, because the people that were the beneficiaries of the New Deal and the Great Society all appear to absolutely hate it. So it's like, why don't we call it something else? But it was sort of based on still on this idea that, like, whether or not it's really about the creation of surplus, I'm not really sure, because that was kind of the aspect of the kind of of John McDonnell's economics that talking about like degrowth, let's say, was completely anathema. That it was actually, we were going to reinflate the economy by reindustrializing, and we were going to kind of like, build wind turbines on a gigantic scale. We were going to put solar panels everywhere. We were going to retrofit all the buildings. We were going to open factories for this, that, and the other all over the country. We were going to build high-speed rail between here and here and here. And very much like that kind of Roosevelt program or the Attlee program after the war, or Harold Wilson's program, that you would kind of reinflate. So it's not really about redistributing a surplus that exists. It was more about kind of like trying to create a kind of one that could then be redistributed. To the degree to which that was that was possible. We'll know the next time we get to try it. But it was absolutely a modernist project. But it was a modernist project which borrowed its language from the 1930s and 1940s, which is a contradiction which is absolutely the heart of like everything I've ever written. So I'm not going to come out of it now.
Right, right. So there is one question on Facebook from a comrade in Berlin who is asking if you could give a soundbite definition of militant modernism, and I guess, well, one, the Turner phrase itself, why you're using militant modernism, I guess, as opposed to just modernism, or why that was the hook. I think I could do it for you, but go ahead.
IKEA serves imperialism. I don't know. I think so. It was just a way of differentiating, because there are modernisms, and there always have been, and there always will be. Like there's the modernism of the people I was talking about. There's the modernism of people that were politically very much in the center. Like, there's modernism people that were very much on the political right, particularly in Italy during this period. There's all sorts of different kinds. So I was just like, here's the one I want to talk about because I think it's interesting and neglected and useful. So that's really what it was. It was like modernism to sort of bash coffee table books on the head. Modernism to destroy the Modern House website, which Berliners might know, but is a sort of estate agent solely for modern houses, which is a monstrous phenomenon.
So, actually, I should mention this comment because Benjamin on YouTube mentions Newt Gingrich's 2012 promise that we would have a moon base by 2020. And he says, how come we don't have that kind of futurist energy in our programs? I'm not suggesting you necessarily answer that, but I should say that that's a promise that I bring up every now and then. I am completely for this moon base. I think the next Bernie Sanders should make it part of their program. I want a moon base, and unfortunately, Newt Gingrich could not be the American de Gaulle, but that's my long game. My long game is to create American communism, not so American communism wins, but so that there is space for American Gaullism to spread.
I mean, this is one of those things where you just see the kind of the kind of paucity of current futurism. Like Elon Musk proposing to do privately what Gosplan did in 1955. Like, it's
just absurd that he thinks he could actually pull it off. Like I'm like the idea that private industry without subsidies could give us Mars exploration, and also that obviously the means shape the ends, right? Obviously, whatever type of Mars exploration they can give us will be infinitely shittier than a more democratic, more public route to get there.
Yeah, I mean, Mars for all is obviously the crucial demand.
So let's see. There's a few questions. I'm not sure if we get to them all, but the sports leader, who I tend to just gravitate to the sports leader's questions because he's just such. It's the type of name that I find in all the YouTube shows that I watch and the podcasts that I watch, which are mostly Nick's podcast, and I like that it's in our space as well. So the sports leader asks. With growing social-cultural atomization, is it more difficult for the left to create an aesthetic, a sensibility with broad appeal?
I don't know. Oh God, that brings me to like all sorts of things that worry me, such as niche marketing, and this is very much a thing that was an obsession of Mark Fisher's, was the fact that the kind of, sort of centralized broadcast culture of things like the BBC meant that everything sort of happened at once, and you could have these kind of mass subcultures that would then, kind of affect life on a much wider level, because everyone was watching the same thing at once. I think the obsession of trying to recover that is why he ended up obsessed with like terrible sort of TV talent programs. But anyway, I don't know. I don't really know. I think it's I think in a way it's also not that big an issue insofar as I think that the fascinating thing about these kind of moments of sort of cultural explosion is that there isn't a definitive aesthetic for the left. There are several that are kind of happening at once. Like I think Lunacharsky, who the Commissar of Enlightenment, as his official role was in the 1920s, played a very good game in and kind of funding the modernists here and the futurists there and the realists there, and kind of keeping them all in the tent. You know, as Castro later said, you know, within the revolution, everything; outside the revolution, nothing. And I think that kind of approach is probably a good one. And then you can kind of encourage, you know, kind of trends to kind of form. But I do think that there is something in the kind of the sort of compartmentalization of media that makes doing anything collective culturally that's going to have like a really seismic effect on the culture incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah, right now it's Netflix movies, which everyone tends to watch and talk about, or limited series, and it's Kanye West. That's why critical defense of Taylor Swift and Kanye West, because they're one of the last pieces of mass culture around.
Exactly.
But let's see. Oh, this question from, I know it's getting very late your time, but Lawrence Dunn has a very nice like personal interest question,
Mm-hmm.
which is question in all caps. If you could live in any residential building from the past or present, which one would you like to live in?
I'm quite fond of the one I live in now, which is a quite ordinary one. It's like a early 1950s public housing block with balconies and plenty of trees in a part of London near two interesting places. And it's really it's not designed by a famous architect. It's on the site of a V1 rocket attack in the middle of an ordinary street where just, and then they built a housing estate on top of it. And I would be loath to move anywhere else, to be honest. So it's a sort of different question from like what's your favorite block of housing, in which I could kind of go, well, you know, the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, you know, Park Hill in Sheffield, Alexandra Road in North London, the Olympic Village in Munich, etc., etc. But I don't want to live there. I want to live in this like Camberwell Borough Council block of 1950, and you will prize it out of my cold dead hands.
That's very nice. So I see we're getting to the point in the discussion where the chats are mostly people admiring your accents, which I always feel like is the most pathetic things Americans can do. We should be proud of our own cultural heritage, our Republican trajectory, breaking free of England and building this flawed republic that we need to fix through, you know, a third reconstruction and so on. But on that note, I feel like we should let you go to bed. But
Thank
if
you.
people bear with me for 1 second, I want to do another round of plugging. One, you should read all of Owen's books. You should read the material that he writes and commissions for Tribune. You should check out his writing in Jacobin. He is not in the latest Jacobin, but he was in this one, which was our spring edition, and he will be in our fall edition, writing on the architecture and history of public housing in both the U.S., U.K., and kind of a topics that spin out of that. So that issue will be out, I believe, on election day. Unfortunately, the thing is, there's very timely content in that issue that might be horribly out of date if the US actually has a very stable election. So banking on instability, we have a doomsaying issue contemplating whether the US is a failed state or a failing state, that you know, who knows, might be out of date when you know, Biden is, you know, wins by double digits, and Trump, you know, he has a great plan to rebuild America, which I highly doubt. But you know, so that will be at November 3rd, and on Wednesday we have Sam Gindin. On Friday we have Bashir Abouania. talking about Palestinian resistance in the last 20 years, where it's going from now. Then on Saturday, we have another edition of Weekends with Anna and Nando. And, I tend to keep going on promoting these things, and that's because you guys tend to stick on the channel. So if you stick on the channel, there's still 100 plus people watching on YouTube right now. There should be more than 100 plus likes, because if you have this kind of dedication to listen to me ramble and promo things, please press like, press subscribe, support Owen's work, and that's it. Thanks to Owen, thanks to our producer Cale Brooks, and have a good night, everyone.
Mm-hmm.